It was a warm evening in Dubai. The kind of night when the city's golden lights reflected on the glass towers and luxury cars lined up outside five-star hotels. Inside one of the most expensive hotels, the Al Zahra Grand, a grand dinner was being prepared for a powerful businessman named Khalid Al Mansour. He was one of the richest men in the city, known for his sharp mind, fancy lifestyle, and the confidence that came from always being in control. That night was special for him because he was hosting foreign investors who had flown in from London and New York to discuss a new business deal. Everything had to be perfect, from the crystal glasses to the soft music playing in the background. In the busy kitchen, a woman named Maria was moving quickly, making sure every dish was served right and every plate was spotless. She was Khalid's maid and had worked for his family for almost 10 years. She came from the Philippines and had always been known for her quiet strength and dedication. While most people saw her as just a maid, those who knew her well respected her kind heart and hard work. She always greeted everyone with a gentle smile, even when she was exhausted after long hours. That evening, Maria was more focused than ever. She had been given the task of helping serve at the Billionaire's private dinner. Her hands moved swiftly as she placed plates and polished cutlery, hoping nothing would go wrong. But this dinner was also different for another reason. She had brought along her teenage daughter, Isabella. The girl had just arrived from the Philippines to visit her mother after many years apart. Maria didn't want to leave her alone at the staff quarters, so she quietly asked permission for her daughter to stay and help. Khalid didn't mind. After all, she was just a maid's daughter, and he barely noticed her. Isabella was a shy but observant girl. She had dark brown hair tied in a neat ponytail and eyes that sparkled with curiosity. Although she wore simple clothes, she carried herself with quiet confidence. She watched everything carefully. The tall chandeliers, the waiters rushing with trays, the wealthy guests arriving in expensive suits. It was like a different world from the small house she had grown up in. As the evening began, the guests arrived one by one. They spoke in different accents: British, American, French, shaking hands with Khalid and complimenting his success. Laughter filled the room, and the clinking of glasses echoed softly. Khalid, sitting at the head of the long marble table, looked completely in command. He loved moments like these when all eyes were on him. He spoke proudly about his projects, his companies, and his plans for expansion. Every word he said carried authority, and the guests listened with admiration. Meanwhile, Maria stood near the corner with Isabella, ready to assist. Every few minutes, she whispered instructions to her daughter. "Bring water to table 3, or pick up the empty glasses." Isabella obeyed quietly, moving carefully so she wouldn't disturb the guests. She couldn't help but notice how her mother's posture changed in front of the rich people. Always polite, always humble. It made her heart ache a little, seeing her mother serve people who barely looked her way. Still, she admired her mother's strength and dignity. The dinner continued with laughter and stories. Khalid's voice was the loudest in the room. Confident, playful, and sometimes a little arrogant. He enjoyed joking with his guests, teasing his staff, and showing that he was the man in charge. At one point, one of the foreign investors said something in English that made everyone chuckle. Khalid laughed too, even though he didn't completely understand the joke. He turned to his translator, who quickly whispered the meaning. Then Khalid looked around and smirked, making a joke in Arabic about how he should probably learn English before his next meeting. His guests laughed again, and he enjoyed their attention. From the corner, Isabella watched, trying to understand the conversation. She had always loved languages and could understand most of what was being said. In her school back home, she had been top of her class in English and had practiced online with videos and tutorials, but she stayed quiet, not wanting to draw attention. Still, when one of the guests spoke to Khalid directly in English about the details of the contract, Isabella noticed the confusion in Khalid's eyes. He tried to laugh it off, pretending he understood, but it was clear that he didn't. Maria noticed it too. She kept her eyes low, hoping her boss wouldn't feel embarrassed in front of everyone. But Khalid was too proud to admit his weakness. He made another joke, this time louder. Something about how even his maid's daughter probably spoke better English than him. The guests laughed politely, not realizing how cruel it sounded. Maria froze, her heart sinking, while Isabella looked down, feeling her cheeks burn. She wasn't used to being humiliated, especially not in front of so many strangers. The evening went on, but the moment stayed in Isabella's mind. She wanted to say something, to prove her mother didn't deserve to be mocked. But she stayed silent for now. She didn't know that this small, hurtful moment would soon change everything. That one careless joke from a powerful man would turn into a lesson he would never forget. And before the night ended, everyone in that room would see the maid's daughter in a completely different light. The dinner was going perfectly. The table filled with expensive food, laughter, and the sound of clinking glasses. Khalid al-Mansour sat at the head of the table, confident and proud, surrounded by powerful businessmen from different countries. He loved moments like these, when everyone listened to him, praised his success, and treated him like the most important man in the room. He had spent his whole life building his empire, and now he enjoyed showing off his power and wealth. As the waiters moved around serving drinks, Maria stood silently near the corner, watching carefully. Her daughter Isabella stayed beside her, holding a tray with glasses, trying her best not to make any mistakes. She felt nervous but also amazed by the grand room. Golden chandeliers, soft music, and walls decorated with elegant art. It was nothing like the simple home she had grown up in. And yet, she didn't feel small or less than anyone. She just wanted to help her mother and make her proud. The conversation at the table turned toward business. One of the foreign guests, Mr. Harrison, from London, began to speak in English. He was talking about the terms of a big contract that involved millions of dollars. He spoke quickly, using complicated business words, and everyone at the table nodded as if they understood everything. But Khalid's smile began to fade slightly. He could catch a few words here and there, but not the full meaning. He looked toward his translator, who leaned closer and whispered the explanation in Arabic. Khalid laughed loudly after that, pretending he had understood it all from the beginning. He made a confident comment to the group, trying to hide the fact that he relied on someone else to understand. The guests smiled politely, though a few of them noticed what had just happened. Khalid didn't like that feeling. The thought that someone might think he didn't understand English made his pride sting. So, he quickly turned the situation into a joke. He looked at his guests and said, in Arabic with a laugh, "Maybe I should hire a better translator next time." Then, trying to sound funny, he added, "Even my maid's daughter probably speaks better English than me." The guests laughed, thinking it was harmless humor, but the words hit Maria like a knife. She froze, her face turning pale. She didn't expect her boss to use her daughter as the punchline of a joke, especially in front of so many people. Isabella stood still, clutching the tray in her hands. She felt every pair of eyes at the table turn toward her for a brief second. Some of the guests chuckled politely, not realizing how uncomfortable it made her feel. She looked at her mother, whose eyes stayed down, filled with quiet shame. Maria didn't say a word. She couldn't. She had worked for Khalid for 10 years and had always respected him. But in that moment, she felt deeply embarrassed. Khalid noticed their reaction but didn't think much of it. To him, it was just a light-hearted joke, something to make the atmosphere fun. He didn't understand how it sounded, how it made a hard-working woman and her daughter feel small. He continued laughing with his guests, pouring another glass of expensive wine. Meanwhile, Isabella stood there quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother had told her many times to stay humble and never talk back, no matter what happened, but still, the words echoed in her head. Even my maid's daughter probably speaks better English than me. She thought about all the years she had spent studying. She remembered the nights she stayed awake after school, practicing English pronunciation through old YouTube videos. She didn't have teachers or fancy classes like rich kids. Her mother had saved every small amount she could to buy her a used phone so she could learn online. And now, standing in that golden dining hall, Isabella felt something stir inside her. A mix of sadness and quiet confidence, because deep down, she knew that the billionaire's joke was actually true. She did speak better English than him. The dinner went on, and everyone acted as if nothing had happened. But the atmosphere around Maria and Isabella had changed. The waiters exchanged awkward glances, and Maria's hands trembled slightly as she picked up empty dishes. She whispered to her daughter in a soft voice, "Don't take it to heart. He didn't mean it." Isabella nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed that. She could see the pain in her mother's eyes. A pain that came not from anger but from years of being treated as invisible. Across the table, one of the guests, a kind elderly man named Mr. Carter, had noticed the exchange. He frowned slightly and said in English, "You know, young people like her are the future. They learn faster than all of us." Khalid smiled at the comment but didn't respond seriously. Instead, he leaned back and said with a grin, "Well, maybe we should test that theory, shouldn't we?" Everyone chuckled again. But no one knew that this small challenge would soon turn into a life-changing moment. As the night continued, Isabella stood silently, her mind replaying everything that had just happened. She wasn't angry. She was determined. She didn't want to embarrass anyone, not even the man who had mocked her, but she wished she could show them that being poor didn't mean being uneducated or weak. In that glittering hall filled with the world's richest men, she made a quiet promise to herself. If she ever got the chance to prove her worth, she wouldn't let her mother down. Little did she know that chance was coming very soon, and when it arrived, her quiet voice would silence the laughter, and the same billionaire who mocked her would look at her not with pride or pity, but with absolute shock and respect. The room was filled with laughter and clinking glasses when Khalid leaned back in his chair, still smiling from his own joke. He felt proud, enjoying how his guests admired his confidence and humor. For him, teasing someone like Maria or her daughter was harmless fun, something to keep the evening light. But for Isabella, standing quietly near the wall, it was a moment she would never forget. She wasn't angry, but she felt something strong inside her. A mix of sadness, courage, and the need to prove herself. The foreign investors continued their discussion, switching again to English. They were now talking about a business proposal, using words like investment returns, legal obligations, and partnership terms. Khalid smiled and nodded, pretending to follow along, but deep down he was lost. He looked toward his translator again, who whispered the meaning softly. It annoyed him that he couldn't understand everything himself, especially in front of so many powerful people. Then one of the guests, Mr. Carter, who had noticed the earlier joke, smiled and said in English, "Mr. Khalid, you really should learn English yourself. Or maybe you should let this young lady translate for you." He pointed gently toward Isabella, who was standing with her tray near the corner. The guests chuckled, and all eyes turned to her again. Khalid laughed loudly, trying to hide his slight embarrassment. He said jokingly in Arabic, "You know what? If she can translate this document correctly, I'll give her my job." The guests laughed even harder, thinking it was another funny moment, but to Isabella, those words sounded like a challenge, one she couldn't ignore. Her heart started beating fast, her palms sweaty, but something inside her told her to step forward. She looked at her mother, who shook her head slightly, whispering, "No, stay quiet." Maria didn't want her daughter to get into trouble or embarrass herself, but Isabella's courage had already taken over. In a soft but clear voice, she spoke up, "Sir, may I try?" The room went silent for a second. Even the waiters stopped moving, surprised by the girl's boldness. Khalid raised an eyebrow, not sure if he heard her right. Then he chuckled, thinking it was amusing. You want to translate this?" he asked, still smiling. "Yes, sir," Isabella replied, her voice steady though her heart was racing. Maria felt panic rise inside her. She quickly stepped forward and said in a low voice, "I'm so sorry, sir. she didn't mean. But Khalid stopped her with a wave of his hand. He was curious now. Part of him wanted to teach the girl a lesson, to remind her of her place. He leaned back in his chair and said with a smirk, "All right then, go ahead." He turned to one of his assistants and said, "Bring me that contract." The assistant quickly handed over a thick document written entirely in English, filled with legal terms and business language. Khalid handed it to Isabella, clearly expecting her to give up after the first few lines. "Here," he said, still smiling. "If you can translate this correctly, maybe I really will give you my job." The guests laughed again. But their laughter faded when Isabella didn't back down. Instead, she took the document carefully with both hands, glanced through it, and took a deep breath. She began to read the first sentence slowly, her voice soft but confident. Her pronunciation was clear, her tone calm. As she started translating each sentence into Arabic, the guests' expressions began to change. Her words flowed smoothly, as if she had done this 100 times before. She didn't hesitate or stumble. She understood exactly what the text said. Even Khalid's translator looked surprised. He leaned forward, listening carefully, realizing that her translation was accurate. Maybe even better than his own. The room grew quiet. The guests stopped whispering and started paying full attention to the young girl standing at the side of the room. Khalid's confident smile slowly faded as he realized what was happening. This girl, the maid's daughter, was doing something he couldn't, and she was doing it with such grace and intelligence that even the foreign guests looked impressed. After translating a few paragraphs, Isabella stopped and looked up shyly. "Would you like me to continue, sir?" she asked softly. There was silence for a few seconds before one of the guests, Mr. Harrison, spoke up. "That was perfect," he said in amazement. She even caught a small translation mistake in the last line. "Our version had an error." Everyone turned to him in surprise, and he explained that one phrase had been written incorrectly in the earlier draft. Yet Isabella had naturally corrected it without even realizing. Maria stood frozen, her hands shaking. She couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Her daughter, who had grown up studying on her own, was standing in front of billionaires and showing her brilliance. She felt tears fill her eyes, not from sadness, but from pride. Khalid sat quietly, looking at Isabella with wide eyes. He didn't know what to say. Just minutes ago he had mocked her, confident she would fail. Now she had done something extraordinary. Something that had silenced an entire table of powerful men. Finally, Khalid laughed softly, but it wasn't the arrogant laugh from before. It was one of surprise and respect. "Well," he said slowly, "it seems I underestimated you." The guests applauded politely, some smiling at Isabella with admiration. Her cheeks turned pink, and she quickly bowed her head, embarrassed by the attention. She handed the document back and stepped aside. Her mother hugged her quietly, whispering, "I'm so proud of you." For the rest of the dinner, the atmosphere changed completely. The laughter was softer, the tone more respectful. Even Khalid seemed thoughtful, watching Isabella and her mother from time to time. What had started as a joke had turned into a lesson, one that none of them would forget. The maid's daughter had proved that talent, intelligence, and courage could shine anywhere. Even in a room full of billionaires, one brave girl had just changed how everyone saw her, including the man who once mocked her. The air in the grand dining hall had completely changed. Just moments ago, the room had been filled with laughter and light jokes. But now, everyone was silent, watching Isabella with growing curiosity. Khalid leaned back in his chair, a smirk still on his face, though deep inside, he was beginning to feel uncertain. He was sure this young girl wouldn't be able to understand even a few lines of the contract he had just handed her. It was a complicated business document written by lawyers. Even his own translator sometimes took time to interpret it correctly. But Isabella didn't seem nervous. She stood tall, her hands steady as she looked at the pages in front of her. The investors exchanged amused glances, expecting a funny moment or an awkward silence. No one imagined that a maid's daughter could actually read and understand something like that. Khalid crossed his arms, watching closely. ready to laugh the moment she made a mistake. Maria stood a few steps behind her daughter, her heart pounding. She wanted to stop her, to tell her to hand the paper back and walk away. But it was too late now. Everyone was watching, and Isabella had already started reading. She took a deep breath and began softly, reading the first line in English before translating it smoothly into Arabic. Her voice was calm and clear, not shaking even once. At first, Khalid thought she had memorized a few common phrases. But as she continued, he realized she was understanding every sentence. Her tone carried confidence, and her eyes moved quickly from one line to another. The guests started to lean in, curious now. They looked at each other, whispering under their breath, "She's really doing it." Maria's eyes widened in disbelief, tears slowly forming as she listened. She had always known her daughter was smart. Isabella had loved books since she was little, even when they didn't have money for proper school. Isabella used to borrow old English textbooks and practice every night. Maria used to come home late after cleaning other people's homes, and would see her daughter studying under a dim light. She used to worry that it wouldn't make a difference, that life would still be unfair. But now, standing there, hearing her daughter speak fluently in 2 languages, Maria felt something inside her break open. A mix of pride, love, and relief. As Isabella translated line after line, even Khalid's translator began nodding slowly, realizing how accurate she was. At one point, she paused, furrowed her eyebrows, and said politely, "Excuse me, sir, but there's a small mistake here." Everyone looked at her in surprise. She pointed to a line in the English text and said, "This sentence says the company will pay after 6 months, but the Arabic version says 3 months. It's not the same." The translator quickly checked and looked embarrassed. She was right. He confirmed her correction quietly, and the investors exchanged impressed looks. Khalid blinked, speechless for a moment. He had never expected this. He had only meant to make a joke. But now this girl was exposing an error in a contract worth millions. The guests began clapping softly, smiling with admiration. One of them, Mr. Harrison, said, "She's brilliant. You should hire her instead of your current translator." Everyone laughed, but this time it wasn't at Isabella. It was genuine respect. Khalid forced a small smile, but inside, his mind was spinning. How could a girl from such a simple background know so much? How could she stay so calm while all eyes were on her? He looked at Maria, who was now wiping her tears, trying not to cry in front of everyone. Khalid felt something he hadn't felt in years, humility. He realized how easily he had judged them, assuming that wealth and education only belonged to people like him. Isabella finished translating the last paragraph and looked up. Her heart was racing, but she kept her voice steady. "That's the full translation, sir," she said softly, handing the paper back to him. For a moment no one moved. Then, slowly, one of the foreign guests began clapping again, and soon the others joined. Even the hotel staff watching from a distance couldn't help but smile. Maria stepped forward, gently touching her daughter's arm, whispering, "That's enough, my love." Isabella nodded and lowered her eyes, blushing from all the attention. She hadn't done it to show off. She had only wanted to prove that her mother deserved respect, and without saying it, she had done exactly that. Khalid finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "You speak English very well," he said, still trying to hide his surprise. "Where did you learn?" Isabella hesitated for a moment and then replied, "Mostly from books, sir, and online videos. My mother worked hard so I could go to school. I didn't want her efforts to be wasted." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He looked at Maria, who bowed her head respectfully, too emotional to speak. The guests were deeply touched. One of them said softly, "You've raised a remarkable daughter." Maria smiled weakly, still holding back tears. Khalid cleared his throat, trying to regain his usual confidence. But it wasn't easy. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like the most important person in the room. Instead, he felt humbled by a young girl's courage and intelligence. As the dinner continued, The energy in the room was completely different. No one looked down on Maria anymore, and Isabella had become the quiet star of the evening. Even Khalid's jokes softened, his arrogance replaced with genuine curiosity and kindness. He asked Isabella more questions about her studies and her dreams. She told him she wanted to become a translator someday, maybe even work in embassies or international companies. Khalid nodded thoughtfully, already planning something in his mind. By the end of the night, everyone left impressed not by the billionaire's wealth, but by the maid's daughter's brilliance. Khalid watched Isabella and Maria leave together, their heads held high. He didn't say much, but one thought echoed in his mind. Respect doesn't come from money or power, it comes from character. And that night, he had just learned that lesson from the most unexpected teacher. A young girl who refused to stay silent, and who proved her worth with nothing but her voice and her courage. The moment Isabella finished reading and translating, the grand dining hall went completely silent. Not a single sound came from anyone, not even the soft clinking of glasses. All the powerful men sitting at the table stared at the young girl standing beside her mother. Just minutes ago, they had been laughing, expecting a funny scene or a harmless joke. But now, every face showed surprise and admiration. Isabella stood quietly, holding the papers in her hands, her cheeks slightly red. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She had only wanted to show that her mother didn't deserve to be laughed at. She didn't realize that what she had just done had shocked some of the most influential people in the room. Khalid al-Mansour, the billionaire who had mocked her earlier, sat frozen in his chair. The confident smile that had been on his face all evening had disappeared. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to say. His translator looked embarrassed. He had been sitting there quietly, but now he understood that the girl had translated everything perfectly. Even better than he had. She had caught an error that professionals had missed. The investors noticed it too, whispering to each other with surprise. One of them leaned toward another and said softly, "Did you hear how fluent she was? That girl is gifted." The other nodded, saying, "I've seen many translators, but none that young speak with such confidence." Maria stood behind her daughter, her eyes filled with tears. She had never imagined that such a moment would happen. Her heart was beating fast, her hands trembling as she realized everyone was now looking at Isabella not with pity, but with respect. Her little girl, who used to read borrowed books late at night under a weak lamp, was now standing tall before billionaires. Maria wanted to hug her right there, but she held herself back. She didn't want to break the silence or draw more attention. Khalid finally leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. His proud expression was gone, now replaced by something softer, almost like wonder. He looked at Isabella carefully, as if seeing her for the first time. "How old are you?" he asked in a quiet voice. 16, sir," Isabella replied respectfully. Her voice was calm, but her heart was pounding. She wasn't used to speaking in front of so many people, especially not someone as powerful as him. "Where did you learn English like that?" Khalid asked, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. "I studied in school, sir," Isabella said, "and also from books and videos online." She looked down shyly, adding, "My mother worked hard so I could study. I didn't want her effort to go to waste." Her words were simple, but they touched everyone deeply. The guests exchanged glances, clearly moved by her honesty and humility. Even the waiters at the back of the room looked emotional. Khalid sat back slowly, letting out a quiet breath. He remembered how he had laughed at her earlier, treating her like a child. He had assumed that because she was a maid's daughter, she couldn't possibly be educated or talented. Now that assumption felt foolish and small. He realized how unfair he had been. Not just to Isabella, but to her mother, who had worked faithfully for him for so many years. The investors began to clap softly, their applause filling the room. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was filled with respect. One of them, Mr. Carter, said with a smile, "You should be proud, young lady. That was incredible." Isabella smiled shyly and nodded, not knowing what to say. Maria finally let out a small sob of happiness, covering her mouth with her hand. She couldn't believe it. Her daughter, the girl she once worried wouldn't have a future, had just earned the respect of millionaires. Khalid stood up, which made everyone else stop clapping. He walked slowly around the table until he stood in front of Isabella. For a second, no one knew what he was going to do. Maria held her breath, afraid that he might be angry, but then he smiled gently and said, "You've taught me something tonight." He looked at Maria and added, "And you have raised an extraordinary daughter." The guests nodded in agreement, smiling warmly. Khalid continued, "When I made that joke earlier, I didn't think much of it. I was wrong to say those words." Maria's eyes widened, not believing what she was hearing. A billionaire, her employer, was apologizing to her in front of everyone. He then turned back to Isabella and said, "You've shown me that true intelligence and strength don't come from money or titles. They come from hard work and determination." The entire room felt different now. Calmer, humbler, kinder. Everyone could sense that something special had just happened. Isabella looked up at him and said softly, "Thank you, sir." Her voice trembled slightly, but it was filled with sincerity. Khalid smiled and nodded, then said, "You deserve to go far in life, and if you ever need help with your studies, you can count on me." Maria covered her mouth again, trying not to cry in front of everyone. Her daughter looked up at her, eyes sparkling. It was a moment neither of them would ever forget. The guests began to talk again, but this time, the mood was completely different. The arrogance and pride from earlier had turned into admiration and warmth. Even the waiters were smiling as they cleared the table, whispering about what they had just seen. Khalid went back to his seat, quieter now. He didn't speak much for the rest of the evening. He just kept thinking about how he had almost embarrassed himself by judging someone based on their background. He realized that the world was full of hidden talents, people who just needed a chance to be seen, and that night, he promised himself that he would never look down on anyone again. As the dinner ended, Isabella helped her mother clean up, but something about her felt different now. Stronger, more confident. People looked at her with respect instead of pity. When they left the hall, Maria hugged her tightly and whispered, "You made me so proud tonight." Isabella smiled and said quietly, "You're the reason I learned, Mama. You believed in me." And as they walked out into the cool night air, Maria held her daughter's hand tightly. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like just a maid. She felt like the proud mother of a remarkable young woman who had changed everything in one unforgettable evening. The next morning, the sun rose softly over the city, painting golden light over the mansion's white walls. Maria woke up earlier than usual, her heart still full from the night before. She sat on her small bed, remembering every moment of what had happened. Her daughter's confidence, the shocked faces of the guests, and the billionaire's words of apology. It all felt like a dream, too beautiful to be true. She smiled to herself and whispered, "My little Isabella, you made me so proud." In the small room beside hers, Isabella was already awake, sitting by the window with her notebook open. She was writing down her thoughts about the dinner, the laughter, the silence, and the applause that followed her translation. Even though everyone had praised her, she didn't feel proud or boastful. She only felt grateful for her mother's sacrifices, and for the courage she had somehow found inside herself. She looked out the window and thought, maybe things will change for us now. While they were having breakfast, there was a knock at the door. Maria quickly stood up, worried that she might be in trouble for something. But when she opened the door, she saw a young man in a black suit holding an envelope. He smiled politely and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Maria. Mr. Khalid asked me to deliver this to you." Maria blinked in surprise, taking the envelope carefully. "Mr. Khalid?" she asked in a nervous tone. "Yes, ma'am," the man replied. "He asked me to make sure you receive it personally." And with that, he gave a respectful nod and walked away. Maria looked at the envelope, unsure what to think. Her hands trembled slightly as she sat back down beside Isabella. "Open it, Mama." Isabella said softly. Maria slowly tore it open, pulling out a letter written on thick paper with Khaled's company logo at the top. Her eyes moved over the neat handwriting, and as she read, her mouth fell open. Dear Maria, the letter began. I want to express my sincere gratitude for your years of service and loyalty. What happened last night opened my eyes to something truly remarkable. Your daughter's talent and your strength as a mother. I would like to offer Isabella a full scholarship to study at any school of her choice in the city, fully sponsored by my foundation. Additionally, I am promoting you to the position of house manager, with an increased salary and benefits. You have both earned this, and it is my honor to support your future. Maria couldn't believe what she was reading. Her hands covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. She looked up at Isabella, who was staring at her in shock. Mama, what does it say? Isabella asked nervously. Maria laughed through her tears and read the letter aloud, her voice trembling. As the words sank in, Isabella's eyes widened, and she gasped softly. He's giving me a scholarship? A real one? She whispered. Maria nodded, still crying. Yes, my love. He's giving you a chance to study. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, holding each other's hands, feeling overwhelmed with gratitude and disbelief. Maria had worked for Khaled's household for over 10 years, cleaning floors and serving guests. She had never expected anything more than her monthly pay. But now, because of her daughter's courage, everything was changing. All the years of struggle, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, finally seemed worth it. Later that morning, Khaled himself visited them. When Maria saw his car pull up outside, she quickly straightened her uniform and told Isabella to stay calm. Khaled stepped out, dressed simply but elegantly, and smiled warmly. Good morning, he greeted. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all, sir, Maria said nervously. Please come in. He walked into their small quarters, looking around quietly. He could see the humble furniture, the worn-out curtains, and the old study table where Isabella had been writing. It was clear that they had lived simply, yet there was warmth and love in every corner. Khaled turned to Isabella and said, You have a rare gift, young lady. What you did last night was extraordinary. Isabella blushed and said softly, Thank you, sir. He smiled kindly. You reminded me that true intelligence can come from anywhere, not just from those who can afford the best schools. Then he handed her another envelope. This, he said, is your scholarship confirmation. It includes your new school details. Classes start next month. Isabella took it with trembling hands, unable to stop smiling. Thank you so much, sir, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Khaled nodded and looked at Maria. And you, Maria, will be the new house manager. You've worked hard enough for others. It's time you receive the respect you deserve. Maria was speechless, tears streaming down her cheeks again. Sir, I don't know how to thank you, she said. Khaled shook his head gently. You already have. By raising a daughter like her. He gave a small smile and added, You both taught me a lesson about humility, kindness, and potential. I should be the one thanking you. After he left, Maria and Isabella stood by the door, watching his car disappear down the long driveway. The morning sun felt warmer than ever. Maria placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder and said, See what happens when you stay honest and kind? Life finds a way to reward you. Isabella nodded, her eyes bright with dreams. For the first time, she could see a future filled with opportunities. Classrooms, books, new faces, and endless possibilities. That day, Maria went back to her duties, but everything felt different. Her co-workers congratulated her, calling her Madam Maria for the first time. She smiled shyly, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. And later that evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, she stood on the balcony with Isabella beside her. They didn't speak much. They just looked at the sky, the same sky that had witnessed their struggles, their pain, and now their happiness. Maria whispered softly, We've come a long way, my love. Isabella leaned her head on her mother's shoulder and said, "And we'll go even further, Mama." Their journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning, but for the first time in their lives, they weren't afraid of what came next. They knew that with courage, kindness, and hard work, even the impossible could become possible. And that night, as the stars appeared above them, both mother and daughter fell asleep with smiles on their faces, knowing their lives had changed forever, and all because of one brave moment that had silenced a room full of billionaires. The next few weeks passed like a dream for Maria and Isabella. Life, which had once been full of struggle and worry, suddenly felt lighter. Every morning, Maria woke up early, but this time not to clean the mansion as before. Now she was the house manager. She wore a new uniform, neat and elegant, and people respected her when she walked by. The other staff greeted her warmly, and even the guests treated her with kindness. It felt strange at first, but she slowly got used to being appreciated for her hard work. Isabella, meanwhile, had started her new journey at one of the best schools in the city. It was a dream she had never dared to dream before. On her first day, she stood in front of the tall school gates, her heart beating fast. The other students arrived in fancy cars, wearing expensive shoes and carrying designer bags. For a moment, she felt nervous and small, wondering if she truly belonged there. But then she remembered her mother's words that morning. "Walk proudly, my love, because you earned this place." With those words in her heart, she lifted her chin and stepped through the gates with quiet confidence. Her first few days were not easy. Some students whispered behind her back when they found out she was the daughter of a maid. A few even laughed softly when they saw her plain clothes and old backpack. But Isabella didn't let it break her spirit. She stayed focused, studying hard, answering questions in class, and helping others whenever she could. Soon, even those who had mocked her began to notice how intelligent and kind she was. Teachers praised her for her dedication, and slowly, she began to make real friends. One afternoon, while she was sitting in the library studying, her English teacher came to her with a smile. "Isabella," the teacher said, "Mr. Khalid told me about what you did that night at his dinner. That's something truly special." Isabella smiled shyly and said, "I was just trying to help my mother, ma'am." The teacher nodded and said, "Well, you didn't just help her. You inspired everyone. You should be proud of yourself." Hearing those words made Isabella's heart fill with warmth. She realized that people didn't just see her as the maid's daughter anymore. They saw her as Isabella, the girl who worked hard and never gave up. Back at the mansion, Maria's life was changing too. She now managed the schedules, handled guest arrangements, and trained new staff. Even Khalid noticed how well she worked and often told others, "Maria runs this house better than anyone ever has." She didn't forget where she came from, though. She still helped her team and treated everyone with kindness. Sometimes, the younger maids would come to her for advice, and she would smile and say, "Be patient and do your best. Life rewards good hearts in the end." One evening, Khalid invited Maria and Isabella to join a family dinner. Not as servants, but as guests. Maria tried to refuse politely, saying, "Sir, I don't think we should." But Khalid smiled and said, "Maria, you and your daughter are part of this family now. Please, join us." When they arrived, Isabella wore a simple blue dress that her mother had saved up to buy. She looked graceful and calm, and everyone at the table greeted her warmly. Khalid's wife, Layla, smiled at her and said, "I've heard so much about you, dear. You're quite the hero." Isabella blushed, unsure what to say, and everyone laughed softly. During dinner, Khalid told his guests the story of that unforgettable night. How he had made a joke and how Isabella had turned it into a life lesson. "I thought I was the smartest man in the room," he said with a small laugh. "But that evening, a 16-year-old girl taught me humility." Everyone clapped for Isabella, and she looked down shyly, her cheeks red. Maria's eyes filled with tears again, proud beyond words. After dinner, Khalid took Maria aside and said, "I want to thank you again for raising such an incredible daughter." Maria smiled humbly and said, "She's my blessing, sir. Everything I did was for her." Khalid nodded and said, "And now, it's time for her to show the world what she can do. I'll make sure she gets every opportunity she deserves." Maria's heart swelled with gratitude. She couldn't believe that the same man who once mocked her daughter was now doing everything he could to help them. The weeks turned into months, and Isabella continued to shine. She started joining school competitions and debates. One day, she even represented her school in a citywide English contest, and won first place. Her story spread quickly, and soon people started calling her the Maid's daughter who silenced a billionaire. It became a story of hope that inspired many others, especially children from poor families. They saw that with hard work and courage, even the impossible could become possible. When Maria heard the news of Isabella's victory, she cried tears of joy. She remembered all the nights she had worked late just to afford her daughter's school books, all the mornings when she woke up before dawn, and all the times she hid her worries behind a smile. Now it all felt worth it. Her daughter was not just studying. She was shining, and every time Maria looked at her, she felt proud and thankful. One evening, as the sun set behind the mansion, Isabella came home holding her gold medal. She ran into her mother's arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "We did it, Mama," she said, her voice full of joy. Maria hugged her tightly and whispered, "No, my love, you did it. You made every sacrifice worth it." They stood there for a long time, holding each other, both knowing that this was just the beginning. That night, as they sat together on the balcony, Isabella said softly, "Mama, do you remember when everyone laughed at us that night?" Maria nodded slowly. "I remember, my dear." Isabella smiled and looked up at the stars. "Now they respect us. But I'll never forget what you taught me. To stay kind and humble." Maria kissed her forehead and said, "And that's why you'll go far, my love. Because you have a good heart." The night breeze was gentle, and the world seemed full of possibilities. Their story had started with humiliation and laughter, but it turned into one of pride and triumph. Maria and Isabella sat side by side, their hearts filled with peace and gratitude. They both knew that life would still have challenges, but now they also knew something far more powerful, that with love, patience, and courage, even the smallest voice could change the world. Years later, the memory of that unforgettable dinner still lived in the hearts of Maria, Isabella, and even Khalid. Time had passed and many things had changed. Isabella was no longer the shy young girl who once stood nervously in front of billionaires. She had grown into a confident and educated young woman, someone people looked up to and admired. Her journey had not been easy, but every step of the way, she carried her mother's strength and wisdom with her. After finishing her studies with top grades, Isabella earned a scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities abroad. It was something neither she nor her mother had ever imagined. Maria cried tears of pride the day Isabella received her acceptance letter. She held it close to her chest and said, "You see, my love, dreams do come true when you work hard and never give up." Isabella hugged her tightly and whispered, "I'll make you proud, Mama. I promise." When Isabella left for the airport, Maria stood at the gate, waving with tears in her eyes. She felt both proud and sad. Proud because her daughter was going to achieve great things, and sad because the little girl who had once followed her around the mansion was now stepping into the world alone. Khalid had come too, standing beside Maria, watching as Isabella walked away with her suitcase. He said softly, "She reminds me of myself when I was young, determined and brave." Maria smiled through her tears and replied, "Yes, sir. But she also has a kind heart. That's what makes her special." Khalid nodded, knowing that Maria was right. Life at the mansion continued, but it wasn't the same without Isabella's laughter echoing through the halls. Maria missed her terribly, yet she found comfort in knowing her daughter was following her dreams. Every week, Isabella called her mother through video chat. They would talk for hours, laughing, sharing stories, and sometimes crying together. "Don't worry about me, Mama," Isabella would say. "I'm studying hard, and I'll come back soon." Maria always replied, "Take your time, my love. Just keep learning, keep shining. Years passed and Isabella graduated with honors. Her name appeared in newspapers and magazines. People started recognizing her as a young linguist and translator who spoke 6 languages fluently. She began working with international organizations, helping people from different countries communicate and understand each other. Whenever someone asked about her inspiration, Isabella always said proudly, "My mother. She taught me everything about hard work and kindness." Back in her home country, Maria still worked as the house manager for Khaled's family. But now, she was more than just an employee. She was treated like a trusted friend. Khaled often asked for her opinion on family matters, and his children respected her deeply. He would sometimes say to his guests, "You see that woman? She's not just my employee. She's the mother of the girl who once silenced me in front of everyone." They would laugh, but there was always admiration in their eyes. It was a story people loved to hear. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. One evening, years later, Khaled hosted another grand dinner, much like the one from that unforgettable night. The hall was filled with important people again, businessmen, politicians, and diplomats. But this time, when the guests arrived, they were greeted not by a maid or a servant, but by a confident young woman standing beside Maria. It was Isabella. All grown up, elegant and graceful, she had returned home after years abroad, and Khaled had invited her as the guest of honor. The guests whispered among themselves, curious about the young woman's presence. When Khaled stood to make his speech, he smiled and said, "Many years ago, I made a mistake at a dinner just like this." He paused, glancing toward Isabella. "I mocked someone I shouldn't have. I laughed at a young girl who turned out to be far wiser than I was. And because of her, I learned one of the most important lessons of my life. Never underestimate anyone." The room grew quiet, and everyone listened carefully as he continued. "That girl is now one of the brightest minds in her field, and I am honored to welcome her back tonight." The guests turned toward Isabella and applauded warmly. She smiled humbly and nodded in gratitude. Then, when it was her turn to speak, she stood up slowly and said, "Thank you, Mr. Khaled, for believing in me and for giving me a chance when I needed it the most." She looked around the room, her eyes shining with emotion. "Years ago, I stood in this same hall as a maid's daughter. I remember feeling small and invisible." She paused, her voice steady but full of feeling. "But that night changed everything. It taught me that respect, kindness, and opportunity can change lives." The crowd listened in complete silence, touched by her sincerity. Isabella continued, "I hope my story reminds everyone here, and beyond, that talent has no class, no color, and no price. It just needs a chance." When she finished, the entire hall stood up and applauded. Maria, standing quietly in the corner, wiped tears from her eyes. Her heart felt so full that she could hardly breathe. She whispered to herself, "My daughter did it. She truly did it." After the dinner, Khaled came to Maria and said, "You must be the proudest mother in the world." Maria smiled and said softly, "Yes, sir, but I'm also grateful. For you, for that one night, for everything." Khaled nodded and said, "It wasn't just one night, Maria. It was the start of something much bigger." Later that night, as Isabella and Maria walked home together under the soft glow of the streetlights, they talked about how far they had come. Maria said, "Do you remember how nervous you were that night?" Isabella laughed. "I do, Mama. I thought my knees would give out." They both laughed, their hearts light. Maria looked at her daughter with pride and whispered, "You turned that moment of humiliation into a lifetime of success. You changed both our lives." Isabella smiled and held her mother's hand tightly. "No, Mama," she said gently. "You changed my life. You gave me strength when I had nothing." They walked in silence for a while, the cool breeze brushing their faces. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and the stars shone brightly above them. For Maria, it felt like every struggle, every tear, every long night had been worth it. And for Isabella, it felt like her story was just beginning. The maid's daughter, who once shocked a billionaire, had now become an inspiration to thousands, but deep down, she knew that her greatest achievement wasn't fame or success. It was proving that kindness, humility, and courage could turn even the smallest voice into something powerful enough to change lives. And as they reached home, Maria looked at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, God," because sometimes miracles don't happen suddenly. They grow slowly, one brave moment at a time.